This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson.
Yes, I am your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome to the last episode of the Spirit and Wellness Show for 2012. The year is at an end. We have passed the Mayan calendar's end, and most of us are still here. Very interesting, and we'll talk about that, as we have been for the past month, about what it all really means and how the Mayans never predicted any such cataclysmic events as got misinterpreted for just popular reasons. Folks love to have a little drama and excitement in their lives, so in case you weren't getting enough, create the illusion of the world ending. And I'll also trot out a interesting theory about all of these doomsday predictions that seem to come with alarming frequency. If it's not the Mayan calendar, then it's the rapture coming, which we hear, every now and then. Some reverend or other pops his head up out of the woodwork and tells us that, the rapture is upon us. So I have an interesting theory I'll share with you about that, that combines this sort of apocalyptic thought with what we know about quantum physics. And you can see what you think about it. You can laugh your head off if you want to. It's just a theory. Why not? Everyone else has one. Well, it has been a difficult week for the loved ones of the lost at Sandy Hook school in the neighborhood there in Connecticut. And I spent quite a bit of time on this last week, so I won't go into too much more detail. If you've listened before, what our take is on that, what our belief system is on these tragedies that we create, and the light that surround all of us, but particularly those more directly connected, that help us to truly understand who and what we really are. And that certainly is happening, has been happening this week. The discussions that have come about, as difficult as they may be, and as maybe sometimes heated as they get, we're beginning to talk about the role that violence plays in our society, and the role that guns play in that role of violence in our society, and what it is that violence reflects in us. Violence is an interesting concept. From a spiritual perspective, violence is anything that causes separation, or more importantly, insists on separation. Violence, and when we think of violence, we think of things like these gun attacks, or physical violence, someone hitting another person, someone beating up on someone, and those are all forms of violence, of course. But spiritually, the violence that we perpetrate on ourselves and on others just through our thoughts is as horrifying as the physical violence acts that may be perpetrated upon us or upon others. Violence comes from a state of mind. Violence comes from a state of disturbance, dis-ease, imbalance, but mostly a belief in what is not real, what is illusion. And that belief is what fear is based on. You've heard probably many people give fear an anagram, false evidence appearing real. And this is what fear is. Fear is the belief that there's not enough, that you are not enough, that others are hurtful and are not you, and can therefore hurt you, and you must hurt them before they hurt you. All of those things are fear-based ideas. And so when we start talking about violence, this inevitably leads us to a discussion of fear. And our fear is represented by all of the angry thoughts we have, all of the violence that shows up in media, in television, on video games, in our stories. These are ways that we have of exploring this idea, this fear, this false evidence appearing real. And at its highest level, we can learn from it. At its darkest depths, it is an immersing in some of your darker nature. So when we talk about, does violence have a place in human nature? Are human beings just by nature violent? That's an interesting discussion to have. And then we need to talk about, what does violence mean? And if it is our state of mind that we're projecting, we're creating these illusions that lead to the illusion of violence, separation, and so forth, then we certainly can change that, because we can always change our minds. Yeah? Well, it'll be interesting to see how these discussions play out in the weeks and months ahead. I don't think this is going away. I don't think people will let it go away. It's profound enough and raised enough awareness that I think it's going to be with us for some time. Let's just say that. All right, so yes, let's go and talk about the Mayan calendar in 2012. And so here's the thing. The Mayans never said that the end of the Mayan calendar meant the end of the world. The Mayan long count calendar was just a way of sort of keeping track of cycles. And the long count calendar keeps track of long cycles, 1,000-year cycles. And what the Mayan long count calendar was saying was that an old cycle was ending on the 21st and a new cycle beginning. So many Mayans who still practice the ancient rituals gathered on the 21st around sites in Guatemala, Mexico, around the surviving Mayan temples, and they had ceremonies. They had rather solemn ceremonies to honor this transition, this change. And what they are saying, what they were saying, and what they have been saying, is that they are hailing the dawn of a new era. Saying goodbye to an old era, and saying hello to a new era. Now, transitions of eras are rarely immediate. In other words, you don't change from one era to the next when the clock turns to midnight. These obviously are gradual over time changes. And this is what the Mayans were celebrating. This is what the Mayans were talking about on the 21st of December. Uh, One gentleman, a shaman, named Carlos Zendejas, led ceremonies for lots of people at one of the ruins, the Moyil ruins, nearby in Guatemala. The air was filled with incense, the sounds of chimes and drumming and chants and songs. And the participants were saying this day and this time on the 21st is where all of the past and all the future meets together. And that's why it's so powerful. Some of the Mayan descendants who don't follow these rites, let the day pass with nary a thought. Those that do still practice it had their ceremonies at the ruins. Most objected to the commercialization and the tourism that resulted around it. Although certainly the government in Guatemala and those businesses in Guatemala probably benefited from a boost in tourism. But those that took this seriously as a religious ceremony, as a spiritual ceremony, they held their ceremonies out of the public eye, around ancient ruins, as I said, in Guatemala, in Lourdes, as well. And their belief is not that this is some sort of apocalypse, but they came to these ruins because they believe them to be spiritual places. Places where the ancient Mayans lived. And that their energy is still around. And by visiting these sacred sites, you can perhaps tap into that energy. So we can say goodbye to the end of the 5,125-year cycle in the Mayan calendar. We had good times, we had bad times, and now we got a new era dawning. All right, let's move on. As we talk about cycles, we can talk about Christmas, which is obviously coming up in a few days. And I began talking last week about the origins of Christmas, and there's been a lot of talk that it's associated with Mithraism. There were many, well, I won't say many. There were two very large pagan celebrations that were very popular in Greece and then consequently in Rome. That were, or many believe, were adopted for the 25th of December to correlate with Jesus, to help people be more comfortable with the idea of Christianity, to be able to celebrate these traditions that they celebrated for centuries, but in a different way. Basically, the idea is, at the solstice, we are celebrating the return or rebirth of light. And Jesus, as an exemplary human of Christ consciousness, the consciousness of light, is the symbol of light being born into the world. And so, as you look back at all of these different pagan rituals, they all have that in common. One of the, perhaps the most obvious one, is the celebration of Sol Invictus, who was the unconquered sun. and was worshipped as a pagan cult for centuries in Rome. Sol Invictus is light itself. And the sun and Christ, or Christ representing the sun or the light of the world, were said to be born anew on December the 25th. So there were many solar festivals, festivals of light, if you will, but Sol Invictus was the one that was celebrated on the 25th, or around the 25th, and has an interesting corollary to the Christ symbolism, because he is the unconquered sun. He is the sun returning, being reborn, and note the idea of the rebirth, that he's back. The birthday of the unconquered sun, which is what the 25th of December was to celebrate. It was to honor an invincible light, a light that would never be extinguished. Now, there's been lots of theories about, did they actually do that? Were they actually using Sol Invictus's celebrations and adopting them for the Christian celebrations? And there's many scholars that believe that that's exactly what happened, and there's others that don't believe so. But in many cases, in fact, in most cases, the parallel is pretty easy to see. And there's been many Christian writings that have related Christ with the sun. For instance, in the 5th century, Pope Leo I spoke in several sermons on the Feast of the Nativity of how the celebration of Christ's birth coincided with increase of the sun's position in the sky, the solstice, of course. But this nativity, which is to be adored in heaven and on earth, he said, is suggested to us by no day more than this, when, with the early light still shedding its rays on nature, there is borne in upon our senses the brightness of this wondrous mystery. So, of course, you know that we just celebrated the solstice, winter solstice, and of course it is the shortest day of the year. So, past the solstice, the light begins to return and get longer and longer and longer and longer. So there is your symbolism, there's your return of the light. And as I've been saying, many Christians have adopted this quite handily. Augustine of Hippo remarks that in a Christmas sermon, he said, "Let us celebrate this day as a feast, not for the sake of the sun, which is beheld by believers as much as by ourselves, but for the sake of him who created the sun." And so that shows that there was definitely an awareness of the Christmas celebration and its relationship to the birthday of the unconquered sun, or Sol Invictus. So it is fairly well accepted that the 25th of December was taken from those celebrations. Also, around the same time, another holiday known as Saturnalia was celebrated, and they were celebrated just before Christmas, December 17th through the 23rd, to be exact. Saturn, as a Roman god, is one of the ancient gods, and the celebration of Saturn is to celebrate sort of a return to the ancient ways, Saturn was also associated with agriculture and the return of uh, uh, the light that would eventually bring all of growing agricultural type things back to life. Uh, he uh, Saturnalia as a whole um, has different connotations to it. There's a carnival atmosphere to it. There's also a very serious tone to it as well, because the revelries that took place in Saturnalia were to celebrate rather the ancient lost mythical ways. Particularly, these were ways when there was abundance everywhere, spontaneously, and no labor was expected. So the revelries of Saturnalia sort of correspond with celebrations of the past abundance that others have shared. So it's a cyclical thing, just much as the Mayan calendar is, except these are shorter cycles. These are annual cycles. And there were feastings, there were role reversals, so that servants would eat with their masters, and their masters would serve them food, and gift giving began in Saturnalia as part of the whole part of the observance. And it was considered to be, by many, a festival of light. The return of the light, the return of the solstice, if you will. So there is that too. And Christmas celebrations, the 12 days of Christmas that eventually, became a part of the whole ceremonies, are some, you could safely say, some amalgam of these ancient celebrations. But you can bottom line it by looking at it as the return of the light, as the birth of the light, the birth of the unconquerable light. And Christ being the spiritual light, if you will, the light of human existence, the light of the world, is part of that. Sun gods are and had been celebrated in that way, to honor the cycles of the world: birth, death, rebirth. In the spring, when we have Easter and we are told that Jesus died and was resurrected, that corresponds with the death and rebirth aspect of almost every sun god that ever existed in pagan lore. It was always his death and rebirth, meaning the rebirth of the world, of springtime coming, and new crops and new abundance and all of that. So these things are all very connected, and it's not to dismiss lightly anybody's religious beliefs. However, these things are stories, as I say, that we've created to tell ourselves about ourselves and who and what we really are. And Christmas is as much a part of that as anything else. All right, so as we head towards year's end, and by the way, this will be, as I said, the last episode of the Spirit and Wellness Show for the year. There'll be no live broadcast on the 30th. So our next episode will be on January the 7th. I'm sorry, January the 6th at our usual 11 a.m. time. So before I leave you for the year, I wanted to go over some memorable people who I feel fought for justice and made some very important spiritual statements just in the things they did. One gentleman is Anthony Shadid, a journalist who lost his life in February while he was in Syria, close to Turkey. His reporting centered on ordinary people who had been forced to pay extraordinary prices for living in the region or belonging to the religion, ethnic group, or social class that they did. He had courage to write about those who were being affected the worst by the Syrian civil war. Let's see what else here. The Cambodian activist, environmental activist, Chut Woody was shot and killed on April 26 in Cambodia. He was the founder and director of the Natural Resource Protection Group and fought to maintain the country's rainforests. And the Cambodian government wasn't happy with that. His supporters are still continuing to fight against logging and deforestation, which are robbing the country of its natural resources and destroying the livelihoods of many Cambodians as well. He was murdered, but the Cambodian government is dismissing the case while the family is still fighting that. Then there's Lai Wengyang, human rights activist, imprisoned by Chinese authorities for 20 years and was found hung in his hotel room in June. The government claims that it was a suicide, but his families and reporters don't believe that. Lai wanted trade unions, independent trade unions, in the province of Yunnan. He was arrested in '89 during, you might remember, the pro-democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square that the Chinese army cracked down on. Well, he was part of that. And he was sentenced to 11-year term in hard labor, held in solitary confinement, beaten so badly that he required hospitalization, and then given a second prison term that he, based on the grounds he had incited subversion for requesting government assistance for the health problems he developed in prison and for his mistreatment. The fight goes on. I think we should remember Malala Yousafzai. I always have trouble pronouncing her name, forgive me, but this is the young girl, the 15-year-old girl who was shot 3 times in the head by the Taliban for campaigning for girls to go to school, and who is making a full recovery, which is wonderful. She's continued to do her work. She's continued her advocacy for literacy and peace, and she's fearless. So that's someone we should remember. I think we should also remember, and I'm going to look at them as a unit, as one person, the 99%. If you remember their movement, the Occupy movement, if you will, who really brought to the fore economic injustice in this country. And also Mr. Peter Higgs, whose Higgs boson particle has finally begun to see some verification, which will, when all is said and done, and these scientific processes take time, scientists are very, very careful about these things, but its proof will lead to a whole new worldview of how reality works. don't have time to explain it all now, but we'll talk later in the new year. And thank you so much for your support. God bless, and Happy New Year. We'll see you in 2013.